All right, I want to remind everyone in the audience that we do have Spanish and Spanish interpreter in the audience. Could that person please stand and introduce himself in Espanol? Thank you. I'm very happy here to be the monitor. My name is Colin Rose. I will be the moderator for the evening and to introduce Dr. Oscar Santos, who will be our final finalist in our final session tonight. Before we start, I wanted to remind everybody that we are live streaming on Boston City Live Stream TV. We are also on Comcast Channel 24, RCN Channel 13, and FiOS 1962. I'd like to thank all the panelists that were here tonight, again, for their service in a third long night that will end around 8 o'clock. Before I have Dr. Santos give us a brief introduction and roll into our questions, I'd like to give the chance for each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their role in BPS. So since the questioning will start on this side, we will start with the panelists on this side.
Switched it up on me.
Yes.
I'm David Shapiro. Thank you, Dr. Santos, for being here at the end of a long day. I'm the parent of two boys at the Curley, two at the, one who was at the Curley K-8, who's now at Boston Latin Academy, one who's at the Curley K-8 in 5th grade. I used to run Mass Mentoring Partnership, which does a lot of work on mentoring and BPS, and now run the national version of the same thing, working with districts across the country. So Thank you so much.
Good evening, Dr. Santos. My name is Gene Roundtree. I'm headmaster at Snowden International School, Copley, kind of one of the neighbors of Cathedral. I've been a headmaster there for 4 years. I was a teacher in BPS for 10 years before that, and I began in the district as a paraprofessional at McKinley Middle School. I'm also the parent of a 2.5-year-old who is not yet in Boston Public Schools, but we're hoping that Boston Public Schools is ready when she's ready to go to school, because she's got a lot of energy. Yes.
All right. Hi, my name is Latoya Gale. I'm the parent of 3 here in Boston, 2 former BPS students and an incoming K-1 student at the Henderson. I also founded Phenomenal Moms, a parent advocacy group here in Boston, and I run Boston School Finder.
Good evening. My name is Caitlin Gaffney. I've been a teacher at the Maurice J. Tobin K-8 in Mission Hill for the last 19 years.
Hello. My name is Beliza Veras Moriarty. I am a parent of a 2017 graduate of BPS from Fenway High School. I have a senior at Fenway High School. I have a 6th grader at the Murphy and a K-2 child at the Murphy. I am also the parent rep of Fenway High School on the board.
Excellent. And I'm Colin Rose. I am the Assistant Superintendent of Opportunity Gaps in Boston Public Schools. I have a 5-year-old who is a K-1 student at the Sarah Greenwood and a 1.5-year-old that's kind of in the same boat as Jean's young one that will be soon embarking on BPS. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody about the format. We will first have a round of questions from our panelists. As that's going on, Liz will be collecting note cards from the audience of questions. After that first round of questioning from the panelists, then we will read out a question from the audience at random. We'll do another round with our panelists, another question from the audience, and then as time permits, we'll have more questions. With that, I'd like to give Dr. Santos some time to have some opening statements, and then we'll get right into the questions. So you have the floor.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here tonight. As many of you may know or may not know, my name is Oscar Santos. I was born and raised in Boston. I was a teacher in the Boston Public Schools. I also graduated from the Boston Public Schools, K through 12. I was fortunate enough to be a teacher at English High School for 7 years, and during that time I taught math, I taught English, I taught literacy, history, and college readiness. Wonderful experience. I had the opportunity in 2003 and 2004 to be a Boston Principal Fellow, where I had training to become a principal in Boston. From 2004 to 2010, I had the amazing opportunity to be the headmaster at Boston International High School, a school that was designed for all English language learners. And we converted that school from a program into a fully accredited high school. Had students from all different parts of the country, all different parts of the world. And during that time, I also served on 3 key committees in Boston. One of the achievement gaps, opportunity gap, that was one of the ones that I was the co-chair for. ELL task force, which now has really become such an important issue. And I was also on the negotiation teams in Boston. After that, I was superintendent in Randolph for 3 years, where there was a district level 4. And then for the last 6 years, I've been at Cathedral High School, where I have worked with inner city students from the city of Boston. It's a philanthropy-based school where I serve as the president. What I'm most excited about and most proud of is the fact that I've been married for 20 years, and similar to you, I have 2 children. My son Jackson is 16, and my daughter Sophia is 13. And I love the fact that we have parents here, because you're the first teachers. You're the ones that really support students as much as possible, and you're the champions for your students. And so thank you very much, and I'm excited for our conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. We did a pregame coin flip to see which side would go first, and the left side won. So we're going to start over here.
Yes. So, Dr. Santos, as a graduate of Latin School, a teacher at English High, and a principal at Boston International, you experienced the disparities between our high schools, the differences in the disparities. What do you intend to do to ensure equity across our high schools?
I believe that there's a couple of things to make sure that you ensure equity across our high schools. The first thing is you look at the data and you say, what is the curriculum that's being taught at the school? What are the resources? There's some great tools now that exist in the Boston Public Schools that we did not have. The Opportunity Index, I think, is a wonderful tool to give you a sense of what are some of the needs. I think that there's an opportunity to look at that Opportunity Index and say, what are the academic Opportunity Index to further support those needs? For example, the fact that 56% of students that are our most challenged students are at 5 district high schools. That's something that's a concern to me, because it's not equitable to have that many students in just 5 schools. And part of that is to really be able to say, what are the resources that are needed to support students? My approach to education is founded on something that I call opportunity to learn. And what I mean by that is that if we know students' needs and their gaps, we need to make sure that we give them those opportunities so that they can be successful. And part of that would be to sit down with all the high schools, with the district, with the central offices, to say, how are we supporting our students? What does high-quality instruction look like in every single classroom? What does our curriculum look like? What are the graduation requirements? One of the things that I saw was that about 30% of our students transfer within schools during their time in the BPS. I think it's important to make sure that we have a consistent curriculum, or at least graduation requirements all the way across, so that if a student does move from one place to another, at least they land properly and are able to be successful. As a principal and as a headmaster at Boston International, I had those challenges. I had students that were long-term English language learners. We had students that were older English language learners, and some students who had some interrupted education. And part of that is creating pathways and really looking at supports to make sure that our schools are equitable, but more importantly, focusing on the data with our students.
Thanks. Next question.
Thank you. My question is related to how you see your role as an advocate and protector of the Boston Public Schools. Over the years, our schools have suffered repeated and more devastating cuts. Since I began at the Tobin School 19 years ago, we have lost our librarian, student support coordinator, shared social worker, school resource officer, assistant principal, student programs, content coaches for teachers, could never afford a guidance counselor, and will again be cut to 1 special educator to serve all of our students on IEPs and the students on IEPs from Mission Grammar Catholic School as well. I'm sure you're aware that 49% of Boston city land is occupied by nonprofits, and since nonprofits don't pay property taxes, the city has the pilot program. If you had the opportunity to read the pilot action group's report, it says that the city's largest institutions, including Northeastern, Harvard, BC, BU, have defaulted on upwards of $77 million in payments, monies that could be coming back into our schools. We have had a great deal of upheaval recently with school closures, building shifts, and even recently voting to turn a vacant school building back over to the city. My question to you is, in your role as superintendent, what would your position be as an advocate and defender of the Boston Public Schools, the resources we have and the resources we've lost?
Caitlin, my role as a superintendent is to be the #1 champion for the school district, and to work with the mayor as he would be the champion for the city, and to work with the principals who are the champions for their schools, and then with the parents who are really critical, or the champions for their children, to make sure that we all get on the same page with one voice to advocate for the things that we need. In terms of the land, what I would say, the $77 million that is, should be appropriated to the schools, is to really bring that conversation to the forefront, to say, here are the things. There's 3 reasons why we need to do that. Number 1, it's the right thing to do. Number 2, it's one of the tax credits. And number 3, it provides a real meaningful relationships in terms of a pipeline and support for the city and the schools to work together. In addition to that, when I look at the city of Boston, we are rich in resources. I mentioned this earlier today, but we have 138,000 college and graduate students. We have 38 local colleges. We have 22 Boston Public Libraries, 10 Boys and Girls Clubs. Those are opportunity zones that we could use and be a lot more strategic about how do we look at the needs at the schools. Again, looking at opportunities, looking at the fact that we may need a behavior specialist, looking at the fact that we may need a guidance counselor, as you mentioned, at your school, is to work with the schools of eds, to work with some of the nonprofits and some of the organizations to make sure that those resources are put in place. When I think about the concept of One Boston, it's making sure that our entire city, whether a kid lives in Dorchester or lives in Mission Hill or lives in West Roxbury, that they're getting those quality access needs. And those are not add-ons. Those are the social emotional needs that students need to be successful. So I would be the #1 advocate, along with a team, to support and spearhead those needs for our city.
Okay. Knowing that becoming a great administrator, teacher, or other staff member doesn't happen overnight, but also understanding the urgency around having rigorous, responsive, and affirming environments for our students, especially those who have been historically marginalized. What is your philosophy around balancing support and accountability at all layers of the system?
As a teacher, Latoya, one of the things that I learned was to have high expectations for students, but to also have high supports. One of the things that I pride myself on as a teacher was to always assess where our students were, and I would do the same thing, and I've done as a principal and as a superintendent, is assess where we are. Then to provide the resources and the support so that you can hold yourself accountable, because you're holding, your accountability is to the students and to the community and to the parents, and to make sure that the employees and everyone understands, here are the expectations, and here's why they matter. Because if we don't do our job well, then kids get hurt. Kids don't learn. If you don't show up on time, or if you don't clean up the cafeteria, someone can slip. If we don't clean off the snow, these are operational things. And I can go all the way through. If you don't have a quality lesson where there's an objective and there's opportunities for students to practice, then those are things that we're not doing well. And part of that is just to be clear and to be supportive and to provide the training and to let people know that these things really matter. And when they don't happen, to have a conversation about why they didn't happen, because it's impacting kids. Every decision that I make and every decision that we make as educators is to support students. And that's the kind of culture that you want to create in terms of support and accountability. And I view them to be symbiotic, because when you support people, you expect them to do their best work. And part of that is, as an administrator, to provide that high level of support with clear expectations. A couple of ways that I did that was at Boston International, we had a school that was completely for English language learners. I was able to work with Boston College and Dr. Brisk to make sure that we trained every single teacher at the school on how to work with English language learners, so that when we broke up into teams and did thematic-based instruction and we looked at academic language, everyone had the training. So that way we were able to work together to support our students. And I'm always proud of the fact that whenever you walked into Boston International High School, at the top when it said, "Welcome to Boston International High School," where we don't say a student can't. We say the student's not able to do this right now, and this is what we're doing about it. And that's something that you own, because you provide the support and the high levels of accountability.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us at the end of what I'm sure has been a tiring day. So you've had a long experience of leadership, both at the classroom level, the school level, and the district level. And as you know, what's very important, for leadership is to be able to share your moral imperative and then also bring others into it so that we can do the work, that's part of the vision of the school or the district. Could you share with us your moral imperative for leadership, and what is your why for doing this work, and how will you bring your immediate team and the district behind you in fulfilling that vision?
Gene, thank you for that question. My why is because I was one of the students in Boston. I was that young man. I went to the Rafael Hernandez. I went to the Grover Cleveland Middle School. I was an immigrant student. I was an English language learner. I was one of those students who was economically disadvantaged. I know that. I lived it. I understand the city of Boston. Part of my why is to make sure that, based on the fact that I got a great education, that my family got a great education, that's my why, to make sure that we do that for all the kids in Boston, so that we can transform lives, so that we can support them to be their best selves. And that why has to be a why that you push others. And I appreciate the fact that you talked about getting others. That moral imperative is something that, as a leader, you have to build in others. And you find out why other people have their whys. And that why then creates that collective vision of, here's what we do as an organization. Again, going back to the concept that I believe is critical, when we say one Boston, it's all of us. One Boston needs to have that vision to say, we are going to eliminate that achievement gap because we have to, because our kids deserve it, and because the city of Boston can do this, and we have to do this. And that would be the way that I would instill that. And then you have to do it operationally every day. It's not just talking about it, it's being about it, it's showing up early, it's taking your central offices to the schools so that we could say, okay, what is going on at this school? Let's bring the central offices, let's have a conversation. The people who are living in the schools, the principals, the teachers, the students, they're the ones that are being most impacted. The people who are attempting to lead the district need to listen to those who are living it, and those are the central office staff. I'm very much of a school-based person to make sure that the central offices support that work. And then last but not least, and we talked about this earlier, is those that are lending a hand, the philanthropy, we need to make sure that it's targeted and that it's focused on the needs of the schools, so that it's not a potpourri of programs.
Thank you.
Dr. Santos, so I get the benefit from the questions before me, so I
Yeah.
sort of want to tag on a little bit to Caitlin's question and the reality on the ground, and then some of the things you've said. You talk about the support and opportunity gap that sort of leads to the achievement gap, because it's not a predetermined thing for students whether they achieve or not. And you hear about the support that has been stripped away from one school, just as an example. And then we've had, a bunch of folks talk about sort of all getting on the same page, unified voice, everybody with a sense of urgency. But as you hear, there's a scarcity mindset which pits our schools against each other because they're being stripped mined of resources. So I guess my question is, based on your experience in Randolph and your experience at individual school levels, and maybe your vision for the school, whatever you want to pull from, both pitfalls and successes, I think would be great. When people are being pitted against each other because they're on the right and wrong side of equity, justice, and resources, how do you get to one voice? Yeah. How do you get there? What do you do? What statements do you make? What norms do you break to show this is about to be different?
Yeah, David, two things. One is that when you create a budget, it becomes a values-based budget on your priorities, and that you bring everybody together, the families, the students, and that you really, really are clear about, here's what we need and why. That allows you to really be able to be explicit about the needs. There's also an opportunity for schools to be a little bit more entrepreneurial. Sometimes we say this school may need that, and guess what? My school needs it too. How do we create some of these programs that we may be able to tag team to support this work? That's something that we don't do well sometimes. I'll give you a specific example. At the high school level, when I was at Boston International High School, many of our students, as I said, we had a decelerated, accelerated high school. We had students who did really well and were moving on the track faster than others. Some of those students ended up going to another course of college because we did not have a big enough class to provide those students with an AP class in certain things. We learned from that. We said, okay, then let's build out different collaborations with other schools. So that's a small way to do that. On the district level, I can tell you that at Randolph, we had a lot of, you want to talk about not having resources, we were really under-resourced. So one of the things that I did was I created a grant for $1.6 million to make sure that every single school had a social worker at the elementary school. That was important to us, and it was really, really, really important and relevant because many of our kids were being, what I would say, almost misdiagnosed in terms of these are some of their needs. And the reality is that they had social issues. It wasn't not academic, and it was not a special ed issue. And having somebody who's trained there to provide those resources really supported that. And you can't blame the families because they didn't know. So part of that is reaching out. In my current role, one of the things that I really have to do is I have to be really front-facing. We have to raise about $4 million every single year to make sure that kids from Boston, I consider Cathedral almost a public school because we get 2% of our money from the state and 85% we raise through philanthropy, to make sure that we raise about $4 million so that kids that cannot afford the education are able to come. And we do that by working with big corporations, foundations, dinners, any type of resources that we can get. And we also build out programs for our students so that they could have internships and other approaches. So part of it, David, to answer your question is we have to behave differently. We have to make sure that we make action steps. And then we also have to look at some of the bright spots. I'm sure that there's some wonderful things that are already happening that some schools are doing. And we need to make sure that we open up some of those ideas and some of those things that are working so that we can begin to do that in incremental ways. But it is really about making sure that we're focusing on doing this together.
Thank you.
Great. We're at the audience participation part, which is a blind pick of one of the questions. I will read. What would you say to a family considering Boston Public Schools for their child? Why should they choose a BPS school?
I would say to a family that wants to choose the Boston Public Schools is please come to the Boston Public Schools, a school district that's committed to eliminating and closing the achievement gap, a school district where there are a lot of great adults who care and work hard, a city that's determined to make sure that we provide your son and daughter with the best opportunities for them to be successful. And part of that is that we have to behave that way, we have to act that way, and we have to follow through with families on that. And to say to families, and this is an important piece, and if we're not doing that, you have to let us know that. Because it's a two-way street, because you have to let us know what are the things that we're not doing well. And that's important because the families then know that you're willing to listen to them. And sometimes when you listen, you're gonna hear some things that you may not wanna hear, and that's okay. But you have an opportunity to respond. And that's what I would tell them, to make sure that they come to the Boston Public Schools.
Great. I think time-wise we're doing pretty well, so I'm going to go to the left and have you pick another one since there's so many great questions. What do you think the best practices of the Catholic school system that the public schools should take a page from?
Having been a head of school at Cathedral, I would say that there's two things that I think are really helpful for the Boston Public Schools to consider. One is something that Caitlin, you mentioned. I think the Catholic schools do a really good job on the social emotional learning for kids. At least that happens at Cathedral. Kids have planning centers, so if a student feels unsafe or feels like there's something that's wrong, he or she can go refer themselves to go get that proactive support. There's also mentoring and internships for students, and this is something that I think is really critical within our framework. It's called the Applied Learning Framework. We make sure that students are learning academics and content, but we also provide internships and experiences for students to go out into the community to do that work. And if we've looked at the research on best practices for students graduating from high school, having that workforce development is something that's critical because it really gives kids a sense of self. It gives them skills that are 21st century skills that prepare them for life beyond high school. So those are two things that I would definitely take from the Catholic schools.
Excellent. I'm going to save some of these for the second round, but wanted to again give the panelists a chance to ask their second question. And if we have time again, we'll go through a third round. So
Okay.
to you.
Okay, so I don't know if I mentioned, but my kids have been combined to 8 different Boston public schools.
Oof.
It's a lot of movement,
A lot of
a
transitions.
lot of ups and downs. And I asked my 2 oldest sons to reflect on their time in Boston public schools. My oldest is a sophomore at Mass Art, and that was something that he mentioned, that the arts were very lacking in schools, and also access to mental health, whatever issues they had, I also had to go outside of the schools to find that for them. How can we bring these things back into our schools so that our kids have a chance to be well-rounded humans and be these great citizens to society? My son, without those outside resources, would have never been able to apply to mass art because we were up against districts that have plenty of art. And when they would ask at our at those tours that you do of colleges, how many people here have taken this course and who's taken that course? Everyone would raise their hands, and my son was able to raise his hand because of outside resources. But without that, he wouldn't have had the chance.
You bring up a very important point. Daniel Pink, who's really well known for this, a whole new mind in terms of the 21st century skills that students need, and he talks a lot about the arts and creativity and some of the important things. So I think we have to push a lot harder and make those requirements part of something that exists in our schools. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but one of the things that I think that there's a great opportunity is with the high school redesign. I think we need to look at our high schools a little bit more differently, and we need to look at them as like early college campuses. These are students who are 16, 17, about to go off to college. Maybe some schools have a great art studio so that kids who want to take art can do that. Maybe other schools have a great maker space so that kids who want to do more digital printing and robotics and coding can do that. I think we have those opportunities to design our schools a little bit differently to make sure that kids are able to meet their personal passions. I can give you a specific example. When I arrived at Cathedral, one of the things that we asked the students were, what were the things that they wanted to really be involved in? And similar to what you just said, theater, arts, music, it gave me the opportunity to work with our board and to work with our donors to build a 15,000 square foot space where kids now have robotics, coding, theater, and those are the programs that need to be embedded into our schools. If they're not embedded into our schools, our kids lack and they don't have it. So I do believe we have to push for that, and we have to make it a value in terms of our priorities when we're looking at the budgeting process, to push for these incredible experiences, because all of us know that that helps young people grow and they're engaged in class. And we want high levels of engagement, and we want kids to find their personal passions.
Doctor, in your opening statement, you mentioned something about being on the negotiating team. My
Yes.
second question is, with the Boston Teachers Union currently negotiating a contract and administrators in BASIS 3+ years without a contract, can you tell us about your experience with collective bargaining, how involved you personally would plan to be in negotiations, and what you see as the role of unions in the district?
Yes. So during 2007 and 2009, I was on the as one of the headmasters on our negotiation team in terms of putting proposals forward. My more experience was in negotiating 2 contracts with the Randolph Public Schools. And we did them quickly. And I think we were fortunate for 2 reasons. One, because we created an academic plan to support the needs of the district. And based on that plan, we had a real sincere conversation with the teachers union about what the needs were. Just to give you a couple of concrete examples, we extended time on learning because we did not have science instruction for the elementary students. And we knew that that was something that we were really lacking with, so we said, let's add time on that. We knew that we had challenges with our special education students, and the state really cited us for that. And one of the things that we did was we put in early literacy programs and made sure that we had literacy coaches for ELA and for mathematics, and we distribute those throughout the school. So part of that is to make sure that when you're doing negotiations, it's about your values to support kids. I think sometimes we get caught up in negotiations and we think about all the other challenges, when at the end of the day, it's really what do we need to do, teachers, administrators, the superintendent, to make sure that we are all able to be successful. It needs to be win-win. What do you need to do your job, because every single teacher wants to do a good job? And then what does the school need and what does the district need? Again, understanding that you can't get everything, but that you have to be forthright about, here's what we can do, and let's get together on the same page to do that. And we were able to do that on 2 occasions. I was involved in all of the negotiations.
And in your role as Boston Public Schools Superintendent, would you plan to be as involved?
I would have to be, yes. And within the Boston Public Schools, I think that there's a great opportunity to, again, have voice and ownership having, similar to when I was on the committees in 2007, 2009, we had headmasters, we had principals, we had central office staff, because that then creates a collective voice. And I think it would be important to even drill that down and have parent councils and students also putting forth some of their thoughts and ideas so that all of it becomes a shared responsibility to the challenges that we have in terms of negotiating.
Oh, okay, my turn again. Okay, knowing that some of the inequities that we have in our system are built in from things like how we assign students to our weighted student formula, how would you propose to resource open enrollment schools to meet the needs of the students who go there? Would you consider changes to the weighted student formula or the assignment system in that process?
Latoya, I've only read it, so I haven't really had a real clear sense of what, there's different types of data. So there's count data, you can kind of look at the numbers. There's like here data, here's what I'm hearing. I think it's important to see it in action to have a better sense of what the challenges and what the opportunities are. In terms of the way I see the weighted student formula, I think that it's an approach to be much more equitable in terms of supporting students who have higher needs. What I have heard is that in some ways that hurts some schools because they may not be able to get some of the resources that they need to support other things. So I think part of it is to be a lot more strategic in terms of what are the things that are working with the weighted student formula and how do we address it to make sure that it meets the needs of the school. In terms of open enrollment, I believe that that's something that really does need to be looked at because at least some of the things that I read is that some students are forced to sign because they did not select certain places, and that's unfortunate. In a time where we have so much automation and ways to connect with people, to say that there was no response, that's something that we need to get better at, I believe, in terms of addressing those opportunities and bringing families in to have that conversation, because that's an important discussion about where you go to school and how you do that. And part of that is to also include the students, because they're involved and it's their lives and it's an important matter. And then looking at this from how do we make sure that we create more quality schools? The reason why we have some of these challenges is because whether it's a perception or it's a reality, is that some families and some students do not feel that all of our schools are quality. And I think we need to really be able to put something in place that says, here's what a great school looks like. And this is something that's done with principals, with teachers, and with students. Say, here's what academic excellence looks like. Great. Workshop instruction. I do, you do, we do. Differentiated instruction. But it's something that is applied for students. It's a school that's safe. Here are the indicators that we can put forth. And again, going back to this weighted formula and opportunity index pieces, we could say, this school's not that great yet. And here's how we need to do that. Somebody asked me earlier, what would I like to be known for 5 years from now? I would say a superintendent that has created great schools based on voices that we've put together a rubric and a standard for, and that we're building those out over time.
One thing that unites us here in Boston is our desire to constantly improve our schools, and I hope that's something that's come through today in your meetings with our various stakeholders. I wanted to, as a school leader, I'm very interested in learning about, about what your vision, your specific vision is around teaching and learning. What are the very specific instructional practices that you will expect to see in our classrooms? And I'd also like to hear a little bit about how what your vision is for coaching, feedback, and evaluation to make sure that the instructional vision that you would set for the district is realized.
Gene, I was fortunate enough to be in Boston from 1996 to 2010. And the reason why I was so fortunate is because I am a disciple of the workshop instruction. And what I mean by that is the I do, you do, we do. Workshop allows students to be involved and engaged in their learning. And some of the research, and all of you have probably seen this, but it's the dimensions of learning. When somebody is basically speaking to you, you get about 5%. When you read something, you retain about 10%. When somebody shows you a visual, you get about 20%. When somebody does a small demonstration, about 30%. But then if I were to say, okay, everybody turn and talk to each other, you'll start making some sense. You get about 50%. But then here's where the magic happens. When you allow students to do, they learn about 75% of it. And when they teach others, they learn about 90%. So when you ask me what my vision for instruction is when I walk into a classroom and students are doing and teaching each other. That is powerful, and that's palpable. I saw this about 2 weeks ago where our 8th graders and our 11th graders were doing a science expo, and they were teaching and working with each other and presenting these thoughts. That's what my vision of great instruction is, and the way that I would go about that is supporting teachers with concrete and explicit professional development on workshop, on differentiation, on student talk, on accountable talk, so that students are turning and talking and having critical dialogues. So that's the way that I look at quality instruction. And the way that I would hold everyone accountable would be the way that I did it in Randolph. We created something that was called the Randolph Way, and we met with all the teachers and we said, what does great instruction look like? We agreed to it with the teachers union. Here's what great instruction looks like. And we said, okay, so we fine with going into the classroom and saying, I noticed, here's what students were doing, and here's the impact on student learning. We were fine with it. We went from a district that did not do any informal walkthroughs and write-ups in 1 year from 0 to 1,742 walkthroughs. And that's why we were able to make what I would say academic gains for our students, because we worked at it and we made it better for our kids.
And then what would your vision for, feedback for teachers, school leaders, and district leaders look like in order to realize the gains that you would hope to see, and where does the evaluation system fit in for you?
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me about that last part. It's the evaluation system. To me, it's about supervision, so that you can supervise and coach someone. Evaluation is when you're making the judgment. So the supervision piece to me is absolutely critical. And part of that is that you look at where the school is. The way we did it was with the central offices. We would do walkthroughs, get a sense, and the central offices in Randolph were our ELL director, our special education director, our assistant superintendent. So we walked through and looked at it and talked with the principals. What are your goals this year? So that they own those goals. And then we could say, okay, that's great. Those are your goals. You had voice and ownership in setting those goals. What support do you need? And then how do we have conversations about that? So all the visits were geared on supporting those goals based on where the school was. That's the only way that I can see goals being successful. If I set a goal for you without you having a voice for it, I'm not sure how well that's gonna resonate.
Okay, thank you.
I think I want to go a step further sort of on LaToya's question about assignment and just get a little bit more to the bifurcation of BPS and the way that plays out. And you probably more than the other candidates have sort of lived in this and experienced it. But as a parent in BPS and at the Curley and now with a son at one of the exam schools, have both seen the effects of parents who are navigating with children and supporting children in certain ways on a certain path who just simply test well and are born to privilege and have other things going on for them and have singular focus on a certain track, and also the privilege of helicoptering out of the system if it doesn't work for them. And then another set of kids who feel left behind, and literally that language is used, like you're still at the Curley in 7th grade, and then another set of kids are gone. Also, if we have a true value in our kids being in diverse classrooms, the way in which this sorting mechanism destroys that often in the way our classes look and the value of diversity sort of being gone. And so I just wonder how you feel about tracking in general. I don't know how it manifests itself in the parochial schools or in Randolph, but it just feels like this third rail that we constantly talk around. And obviously there are winners and losers in it. So I just sort of wonder how you would attack the issue of tracking and just where you sit on differentiated learning and tracking in general at all levels.
Sure, David. To your first initial point in terms of parents having to straddle and have all these challenges, that's a real issue. I always wonder and worry if a kid lives in East Boston and the bus is late and the kid has to be driven all the way to Dorchester. That's difficult for the parent. It sets the day off wrong for the parent. They're late to work. It hurts the kid because then he or she is stressed out because they're late to school, they get marked. So I understand that piece. That's real. Those are dynamics that we need to get better at in terms of what I would call operational excellence. In terms of the opportunity to look at what you would call tracking or following students, we have to be, I am an advocate of opportunity to learn for all students. I think we need to have students be their best selves and where they are. I went to Latin school. There's some kids who don't want to go to Latin school. But I think every single kid who wants to go to Latin school should have the opportunity to not only, which I think is a great step forward, to take the exam during the school day, which I think is number one. Number two, if that student wants to take that exam, then we need to make sure that that student gets the ISSEE tutoring that is provided so that he or she has the opportunity to be prepared for that. And I believe that those are some of the ways to support that. The other thing that I think is critical that may have been missed or you might have implied it, or maybe I'm inferring this, is that we need to move away from schools that are in some ways being stigmatized as not a school that's a good school, or that school's being left behind. We need to stop that, and we need to be able to really, again, go back to this is a great school, and this is what the school does great, and then and provide the resources and the supports and the programs that you were talking about that have the arts, so that you're not just saying, oh, I have to go to this school and I got left behind. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I think the only follow-up I would just wonder how you feel as an educator with such vast experience is just, is the test the right mechanism for that? And if you are sending a message to kids that some people did well on the test and some didn't, how are the ones that didn't feel well going to feel like they're going to a place that's a great place? You know, like that's just in the psychology of children and parents.
Yeah,
Is the test
no.
the right mechanism?
That's you know, in terms of when I think about any test, or even this test specifically, when you don't do well in an exam, it's almost kind of like that restorative justice piece for an exam. You know, there's restorative justice for discipline and how do we get through this. I think that we need to think very much in the same manner when we're talking about assessments. Why did you not do well on that? Did you tank it because you didn't want to go? Did you, not do well because you weren't prepared? And this goes just beyond the exams, the ISC or the exam test, but testing or exams in themselves, so that we can find out, again, going back to Jean's point of the why. Why did you not do well on this? That's one of the pieces that I think we miss. Yeah. And that's something that I would spend more time with, and I would push leaders to really think about that, and push the teachers to, again, there's a framework that's called the Wallace Framework. I know that I can't get into every single classroom, but the Wallace Framework basically is focusing on here's students' needs, then let's work with the teacher. What are the teacher's needs? Go to the principal. What are the principal's needs? And then you look at what are the principal's needs, how does the district respond to that? So it's a wraparound service that goes right back to the student. So I would really push for that and make that a priority.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to do round two of audience questions. Start here. Whatever you want.
This one.
Now that we have the flexibility under the Look Bill, what is your view of the use of native language in the instruction and support of ELL students and ELL students with disabilities?
Latoya, I believe that native language instruction is absolutely critical. Well, I know you passed the question.
No worries.
But
Anonymous,
I believe it's absolutely essential because much of the research shows that Stephen Krashen has done this and Noam Chomsky, when you really learn your first language well, that gives you that academic foundation to build out your second language. And if the goal really is for students to learn, using that native language as a foundation is essential and very, very helpful. There is no negative impact on learning a second language if you're learning your first language well, because you really get the foundations for that. So I'm a strong proponent for native language instruction, but again, it's choice. You know, the Look Bill and certain things allow, the Look Act, allow families to have choice and to really negotiate some of those things, but I am a very strong proponent for native language instruction.
Back to this side. Okay, another slip. How do you hold schools accountable for achieving district policy goals for teacher diversity in a system of autonomous schools?
I'll try to answer the question because I think it's asking about the diversity for autonomous schools, teacher diversity.
So I think in general, whoever wrote this, see our schools as very autonomous. So how do you hold individual schools accountable to teacher diversity as a central office?
I think the same way that you would hold any school accountable, because really what you want to make sure that happens is that our schools are as diverse as possible, and because that supports learning for all of our students. And because a school is an autonomous school, it doesn't mean that you don't have diversity targets and supports to really be representative of the district and where your school is to support those works. And I would actually find a way to figure out if that is an issue and if that's a challenge, so that we can look at the data to have those conversations about why that is happening, because it would be important to try to figure out what the challenge is so that you can address it in an effective way.
All right, so we have plenty of time left. I'd say we probably have about a half an hour before I want to give the floor back to Dr. Santos to do a final presentation. So we can whip back around. This can be popcorn, so who has a third question that they're itching to ask right now? Latoya.
Uh-oh. Okay. Which one do I want to ask? How about this? When a new superintendent arrives, they may bring innovative ideas, staff, and policies with them. What are some current policies, practices, and positions in BPS that you would restructure, and why? And what are some that you would like to keep, and why? And can you give me an example of how in the past you've worked collaboratively with, whether it's administration, teachers, families, when you've taken over a leadership position?
Great. In terms of, I would probably begin this by giving you a sense of how I would enter into the superintendency before I would go into any restructuring or what I would keep. My idea would be to make sure that I do three things. The first one is to listen, learn, and then lead. And the listening part would be at three levels. It would be to listen to, at the school level, principals. What's going on, what's happening, what's working, what's not. Touching base with families and touching base with students. There's 125 schools. Minimum, I would have 125, a group of 125 representatives that we would meet throughout the year, at least once a month or once every 2 months, to discuss what are the things that are working and not working. And that would be a representative from each school, which would be either a principal, a teacher, a student, or a parent. Because that way you gather that information in terms of what's going on. Again, going back to the count data, looking at the numbers to figure out, Latoya, what's happening here, how is that working, not working. Then the HERE data, why is it working and not. And then last but not least, I think where the rubber meets the road is from September to December to get myself and the central offices to go visit the schools. Once we've done that, where we've gathered enough information, we can start really putting together a plan and saying, okay, here's some things that are working and here's why we think they're working. Here's some things that need some attention and here's why we know they need some attention. And let's begin to put a plan in place to restructure and to keep and to address some of those things. I'm not one that would come in and say we need to change this today because I wouldn't know enough about it. And that would be disingenuous of me to come in and say, here's what we're going to do today without really knowing. The other thing that I would really do is focus on creating a sense of ownership with our team. And the teams to me would be, again, principals, central offices, our academic superintendents, so that we have a clear strategy on some of the data points that we're seeing to be able to address some of those things. Is there a specific?
No, do you have some examples of in your past when
Yeah.
you've taken over leadership,
Sure.
where this worked well or
Yeah.
maybe where it didn't work well?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. I did have to make a good number of changes in Randolph. And I'll give you an example. When we did our walkthroughs from September to November, it was a smaller district. By November, I realized that we had a major problem with special education. And I kind of realized it on the first day, to be totally frank with you. And the challenge was that special education was being done in a very much of a compliance mode. And kids were being excluded. And we did not have what I would say an inclusive classroom. So one of the things that I knew was that we had to change that immediately. And that took, by November, December, we were working towards getting what I would say assistant principals and people who understood how to work with special education students so that we could do much more of a push-in model to make sure that kids were being included and supported. So that's something that we had to take care of. Another example of something that we had to do, which I'm really sad how we got to this point, but it was the case. Our alternative ed program in Randolph had existed for 6 years. And when I did the count data, I realized that not one student had graduated in 6 years from that program. So again, I said, oh my goodness, we have a major problem here. I knew that I had to reframe that program, so we called in, we did some data mining. We asked kids who were part of the program what worked, what didn't work. We found out that it was not personalized, that kids were not getting attention, that it was not an inclusive program, and that's when we created a program that we thought would address those needs. We brought in our Director of Family and Community Engagement to make sure she met with the families. We asked teachers who wanted to work with this population to opt in, and then we also provided UDL training and more hands-on training so that they could do more applied and personalized things. So yes, if there's some things that need attention, and we see it and we know that it's drastic and that it's not impacting kids, I would make those changes. Those are some examples of some things that I've done.
Okay. So, Dr. Santos, 15 years plus in BPS, 8 different schools, 2 kids on IEPs. What should my experience be when I walk into my kid's school? What should a family's experience be?
Yeah.
How should they be treated?
They should be treated the way that my family was treated at the Rafael Hernandez, and that's one of the reasons why I'm here. A school that has equity is a school that respects families, that works with them, that knows their son and daughters, that understands their needs. That's the way you should be treated. That's the way every single parent should be treated when they walk into the Boston Public Schools. They should be treated like the customer because that's who they are. Rule number 1 is that we are a service agency, and parents are our customers, and students are our most prized possessions, and that's how we have to treat them every single day. Treat them with respect, treat them with care, make sure that we provide them with the respect and the things that they need. That's the way that you should be treated. You should have the resources and the respect that is needed so that you know what you need to do to help, that the school knows what it's doing to help your son or daughter.
A group of Tobin teachers were recently awarded a Teacher Leadership Fund grant to focus on attendance. We endeavored to explore this topic as it is an issue of primary importance to teachers and schools. Educators and administrators are devoting an incredible amount of time to all facets of the attendance work. We have found that our district resources are thin and our supervisors of attendance are overstretched. With attendance now being an accountability measure and schools being held harmful for absenteeism, can you speak to some initiatives that you have taken in your previous positions and what supports you would put in place for families, teachers, and schools to improve attendance numbers?
This came up earlier today where I was told that there's 5 attendance monitors in the district, and that's not enough. And I jokingly said that there are probably more than 5 because I know a lot of great principals and headmasters that are doing attendance work, calling and really trying to push with families. But to answer your question, we need more. In addition to needing more attendance managers, I think that that's wonderful that the teachers at the Tobin have gotten this grant. That may be what I would call a bright spot so that we could look at that as something that's working that we may be able to use in other schools. Secondly, when I look at attendance, the question really becomes why are students coming late? Is it because there's a parent issue? Is it a transportation issue? Is it that the students don't want to be in school? And that's something that is a concern. So really figuring out why students don't want to be in school is something that would be incredibly important to me for 2 reasons. Because when kids are not in school, they're not learning, and then they're more susceptible to get themselves into trouble and do things that are not healthy to help them succeed. Some of the things that I've done, and I can go back to being at Boston International High School, we actually opened up a Saturday academy. We had students who were older English learners, and many of them were first generation, really just recently arrived. They had to work from 3 to 11, and they could not stay after school. and we had great teachers. We worked with our union rep. Many of our kids came on Saturdays to get that extra work because they knew that they were cared for and supported. At Cathedral, we did something that's a little not as similar as at Boston International, but we worked with our staff and our teachers, and we made sure that our day started at 8 o'clock versus 7:30 for our high school students. Now, that's easy at one school because it's not as complicated, but those are some of the things that we've done on the district level. We worked really closely with our Director of Family and Community Engagement to address those issues, especially with our elementary school students, to work with the families and with the principals and to find out when your son and daughter comes late to school, they're missing that literacy block. Because that was the most important time in the morning where kids are getting the literacy block. And we really had to explain to families, this is such critical learning time. So it's, again, doing this in small steps and in broader steps to support that work. I commend you and the Tobin staff for doing that work. I hope it works. And in addition to, as you said, it's a monitoring tool, but it's also something that is really at a core value of making sure that kids are at school on time to learn.
Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that question? So one of the things seemingly we do is because, we focus solely often on parents and guardians as a child's advocate, and obviously they should be, and they want to be often, but often have lives that are distressed for a variety of reasons around inflexible work, around lots of different things that allow them not to be able to show up for their student the way they might want them to. What have you seen as strategies, like around attendance, for instance, in terms of, when you get to that why, other folks, sort of relationship-based approaches that can help get young people to school and finding out about other advocates for them rather than all the total energy going towards parents and guardians, and if there is a social capital gap, just kind of perpetuating that because we keep barking up the wrong tree.
David, you bring up some really great thoughts in terms of the fact that it's not just the parents, but it's also peer-to-peer is absolutely critical to make sure that kids know that you're letting your peers down because this is a classroom-related opportunity. But one of the things that I think we did incredibly well, and we do this well at Cathedral, we did it really well at Boston International, and we started doing this at in Randolph, and I think it got a little bit better. We had the opportunity to learn index. It was OTL, and basically what we looked at were what are the data points that are hurting kids. And when we were able to determine that the attendance was an issue, we would ask the students, at least at Boston International, we really worked this out well, where they had somebody that was their support guide. Who's the person that's going to help you, whether it was another student, whether it was a classmate, whether it was somebody that you cared about, and that really helped kids because they needed to have an advocate to support them. At Cathedral, it's a little different because we have support services that do that to really support the kids to do that. So we have some staff to support that piece. But the OTL piece that we did in Randolph was great because even when kids came late, when we got an after-school provider who was, they were called Springboard, we made sure that whatever the kids missed, the after-school provider was working with the kids' needs. So even if the kids were late, this was not an after-school program that was like a free-for-all and play sports or do something else like that. We made sure in the RFP, and I made the final decision on this, that the RFP was about a program that would work directly with the needs of students based on their literacy and their mathematics. So if they were late, we already had that into our framework. They received it and they were able to catch up to do that work.
Great, thank you.
So the issues that face all urban districts also face us in BPS, as I'm sure you're well aware. And one of the things that's been encouraging for me is that we've really renewed our focus on increasing our lens to focus on racial equity in our district and achieving equitable outcomes for all of our students. Although we've made some progress, I think we all acknowledge that there is more progress to be made. What role do you see racial equity playing in your potential leadership of BPS? And can you give us one example of an initiative that you've championed in a past district or in a past school that you've led that has had the impact of creating greater racial equity?
Sure. In a city like Boston, racial equity is predominant. You know, you look at Roxbury and West Roxbury, you're talking about probably two different worlds. You know, the way you engage with someone who's actually Latino in Dorchester, primarily Dominican and Puerto Rican, versus the way you engage with Latinos in East Boston, which are predominantly from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. So there's a lot of cultural relevance that you need to have in terms of that. So racial equity is critical in terms of the lens. Boston is a small city, but there's a lot of different races, challenges. The other thing that I think about, Gene, is the recent study that just came out on the color of wealth in Boston. That broke my heart, that the average family assets for an African-American family in Boston is about $700. For a Latino family, it's like about $1,500 or $2,000. And for a Caucasian family, it's $256,000. So when you take that into account and you think about racial equity and how do you make sure that that happens in schools, and then how do you make sure that you address that at the school level, you have to make sure that that's something that you're very much focused on. Just to give you a concrete example, when I arrived in Randolph, our central office team, 20 people, 2 people of color, including myself, 10%. By the time I left there, we were at 35%. And I was proud of that because our Director of Family and Community Engagement could really make those connections with some of the families. Our athletic director, our ELL director, our special ed director who spoke Cape Verdean Creole. There's things that you can do as a leader that you have to champion. And you have to champion that because you have to present that and you have to make sure that those initiatives make sense. In addition to that, you know, you also look at mentoring programs. And one of the things that we have really worked on at Cathedral is making sure that students have internships and that they have mentors, people that can support them. We try as hard as possible to make sure that they look like them. When we do our career day, which we do every 2 years, excuse me, and we have adults coming to do roundtables with our students, we try really as hard as possible to make sure that there's lawyers that are African American, Latino, you know, Asian. So we really want our kids to be able to see people that look like them that are succeeding. So that's something that we've championed and that we believe in very much, because you need those models of excellence to make sure that kids can aspire to be those leaders that they want to be too.
Can I ask one more question? I want to kind of build on the equity discussion that we're having. There's a lot of different diversity in Boston, but sometimes the voices that we hear don't match the demographics of our actual school system. How would you respond if you were superintendent and the voices that you heard the most often or the loudest did not look like the families who were in our schools and our classrooms? What would be your strategies and how would you respond to make sure that you actually heard the voices that matched our families in schools?
Latoya, that's an excellent question. If you look at the city of Boston and you just look at our demographics, 76% of our kids are Black Latino. And part of that is how do we get those voices out there? I had a similar challenge in Randolph. 86% of the kids in Randolph were non-white. And the way that you do that is by building relationships. I started a basketball league with dads in Randolph, Sunday mornings, so that they could feel comfortable and we could say, look, what are the academic issues that you're having with your students? We hired a great director of family and community engagement that started doing literacy nights, that started doing advocacy programs for families on how do you support students in your classroom. Part of that is that we have to, as we are great teachers sometimes, and unfortunately sometimes we expect parents to have the answers. Our job is to teach parents also how to engage, how to navigate schools. And if we don't do that, we do a good job and we're working really hard doing that with students. And I'm not saying that we're not doing that. I don't know what's happening in Boston, but I know that this is, you know, Beverly Tatum speaks a lot about this and so does Karen Mapp. Building out the skill sets of families so that they can advocate for their children. Lisa Delpet talks a lot about it too, other people's children, how you build that capacity for parents so that they can be advocates for their sons and daughters. I know this because, you know, sometimes when we're at a school, and I'm sure this has happened to all of us, we tell somebody, come to a meeting at 9 o'clock. because it suits our schedule. What about if that parent has to take a day off because, similar to my mom, they have to go and do a tough job, which was really, cleaning services, and she couldn't take a day off. So sometimes we have to be a lot more cognizant of those things and to build the confidence of the parents so that they can advocate for their children. And I believe, Latoya, that sometimes a lot of parents don't know how to advocate as well, not because they don't want to, but it's because something that we need to build some of those skill sets.
I'd like to break it up. Let's take another audience question. Pretty similar to what you just asked, sorry. Can you share how you meaningfully engage parents in all stages of decision making? It's a little bit different, a little layered. From initial idea gathering to final decision making.
Sure. A couple of examples that I can give on that. I'll give you an example from Boston International and then one from Randolph. One of the things that we engage parents with, and I think I spoke about this in my intro, Boston International in 2004 was initially a program for kids to learn English, and then they would have to think about this. Students were already transitioning, coming to learn English, and then go get transitioned to a district high school. So the kids and the families were very much against that. And they wanted to make sure that Boston International became a fully accredited school because they wanted to have a full school, similar to what we've all wanted. We didn't want kids to transition again. So our approach was to meet with the families, in some cases use some of our students as interpreters to help because they were different languages, and to build a plan working with the Office of English Language Learners, who were incredibly supportive, the high school renewal office, again, to build up some of their skill sets to say, here's what we want and why. The parents knew that they didn't want their kids to move, but they didn't have all the background and the research, so we had to explain some of those things. They understood it, so part of that was how do you build that. The second way that we did this in Randolph was with our district accelerated plan, and it was about creating whole school improvement plans for our school with goals and objectives. And part of that was engaging the parents right from the beginning. Here's what the district is trying to do. We had a through line that went from district to schools, to classrooms, to teachers, to parents, to students. And that was important because to me, it was everybody's involved here. And here are the goals for the district, and here's what we're doing. Here are the goals for the school, and here's what we're doing. And everybody had to own those goals in terms of, I'm going to try to be at the school, I'm going to make sure my kid comes to school on time, all those kinds of things. So to me, those are the ways that you build that ownership so that everybody feels that they have a part in the work that's taking place.
What is your philosophy on creating a structure of quality social and emotional support and career readiness for BPS students?
This is something that I really enjoy doing. I'm currently working with Northeastern with something that's called NEXT. It's experiential learning. And the idea is how do you create dynamic learning for students that goes beyond the classroom. And to me, it's kind of like that workshop instruction piece where it's the I do, you do, we do, but the experiential piece takes it to the next level because kids are doing internships and then they're badging and really reflecting on their learning. And part of that is to connect that with the business community and to connect it with kids' personal passions. To me, that's really important and forefronting because it engages students in learning in something that they want to do. And it prepares for workforce development. And again, then there's opportunities to almost create like a LinkedIn for kids. Here are the skills that I have, and here are the things that I can bring to the table. A specific example, the students at our school did the marketing program with Connolly Partners. They created the marketing plan for the school. We have students who are creating speakers with Tom DeVesto with the Social Innovators Club. So when you engage students in what I call project and product-based learning, they own that. And then they build those skills to have those opportunities, which I think goes much further beyond. And I spoke a little bit about this in terms of the high school redesign work. I do believe that there is an opportunity in the city of Boston to bridge the divide between industry and academics, through workforce development. And part of that is through using some type of, whether it's a relational automation. Here are people who are interested in helping kids learn about banking. Here are people who are interested in helping students learn about nursing, whether it's a job shadow or small programs. Those are some of the programs that we've built with Tufts Medical and other organizations. And I think that, again, that goes back to the idea of One Boston and looking at the city as a resource to support comprehensive learning for kids.
Can I jump in on that real
Yeah.
quick? Because I just thought about something that my husband's been telling me to ask. Um, So college, what you're talking about, careers, college is the ideal, but it's not the reality for a lot of kids.
Yep.
And trades really offer a chance for a great life and job security,
Yeah.
and really the American dream, especially for my family that came here in the 60s. What are your plans to invest in Madison Park?
My plans to invest in Madison Park, or what I would call workforce development, whether it can be at Madison Park, which I think is a great space, is to look at the industry of work that is out there right now. Charlie Baker just came out with the report that just came out that there's about such a shortage in what we call adaptive learning technical skills that kids don't have: coding, programming, nurse technicians, advanced manufacturing. All the needs that are out there that are critical, that are not just, there's also plumbing, there's also different types of programs, is to make sure that we look at the industry-related needs that are out there so that we can create those pipelines for students. And I would actually would say that should be something that should be district-wide. That should almost be something that kids should want to learn after school. Some kids, not every kid wants to play sports after school. But I guarantee you that if you tell some kids you can go get your OSHA certification to look at construction from 4 to 6 and go 2 times a week, kids will show up. Or go to an art studio to learn how to become an artist. Those are some of the things that I think we really need to think about. And that would be something that I think should be done in the city of Boston in terms of, and Madison Park would be a great place to do that. And it should be district-wide. It shouldn't just be for one place. I think that sometimes we try to put all things in one high school, and I'm not sure that that's possible to do, because I'm not sure the demand is there, number one. And number two, it's almost, it would not be a good use of resources. But we know that kids have flexible campus. Gene's school is Snowden's right down the street. Kids, if he can trust his kids to get there from 12 to 12:45. We used to have that at Boston International. Kids have flexible campus. Get there on time. We respect you, and if you don't show up on time, you're absent, and that's a problem. So it's about giving kids those opportunities and trusting them to let them know that they should have some of the voice and some of the ownership in the decisions.
I'll pick one more from the audience. I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. This is long. But kind of given the research around school closure and the recent discussions around Bill BPS, what are your feelings around school closure? Would you close schools? And if so, what would you do to mitigate the harm for students?
Yeah, Colin, based on the way that I've read the Bill BPS report, there's going to be some schools that actually have to be closed because either closed or recreated because they're so dangerous. So that's one issue that I believe. The second piece is that it has to be done with humanity, intentionality, and a plan, because you don't want to disrupt the learning in the community for students and for teachers. And part of that is to bring stakeholders together to say, okay, here's what we're doing, or here's what we're thinking about doing. How does this impact what we're trying to accomplish here? What are the challenges? What are the concerns? How do we phase this out in a way that's meaningful, makes sense, and supports kids, so that if you know a school is going to be, being refurbished or redone in 2 years, you say, let's not take students right now, let's exit these students out in 2 years. It has to be done in a humane and systematic way that is not disruptive to the learning of kids. We already have students who have traumatic experiences and tough lives, and when you take that sense of community away, that's something that's dangerous. Secondly, I think that we need to be a lot more forefronting in terms of how we look at Build BPS. We also have to think about an instructional framework. How are we going to use those buildings? What are those buildings going to look like for the academic programs that we want to put forth? If we don't have the academic programs to build that out, it's going to be, we're going to reshuffle the furniture. I want to just give you a specific example. When I arrived in at Cathedral, I knew that I wanted to create this applied learning framework. I know that that's the future of where we want classrooms to be, and we want things to be dynamic, but it's not what I wanted. I was able to sit down with the families, with the students, with board members, alumni, and we said, okay, what does this look like for us? We had a visioning day with Dell and with Autodesk, and we created that, and we put a video together and say, here's where we're going. These were the voices. What are the concerns that people have? In the process of raising the $8 million to build the building, I knew that I had to get moving and build the human capital. Because you can build something beautiful without having the human capital. Build BPS needs to be Build BPS for the buildings, and then build BPS for human capital, so that the staff really has the resources and the training to make sure that they make best uses of those buildings. So I don't know exactly, I know that there's going to have to be some consolidations, and I know there's going to have to be some work that needs to be done to really academically fit. Some people said, do you want to right-size the district? And I said, no, you have to academically fit the district. What are our academic needs? And then how do we build the space around that with buildings to help us build that in an effective way for our students? So I hope that answered your question, or the question that was answered.
Right. So we have about 8 minutes left. So I wanted to give you the floor to kind of make your final case as to why you are the right person to lead this district into the future.
So first of all, thank you very much for all your questions. As you can tell, I enjoy academic discourse and sharing ideas and thoughts. But the key to this important work is that all of you are parents. All of you are educators. Parents play a huge role. You are the champions for your children. And as the champions for your children, it is your moral imperative and your right to push and support your kids and to push the district for excellence for our kids. Because as your superintendent, that's what I want. I want you to push me so that I can continue to push, and I want us to be able to push together for an excellent school district that's focused on equity, excellence, inclusiveness, innovation, accountability. And it's something that we need to do because we need great schools for all of our kids. It can't be about one school that's good over here, one school that's bad, the left behinds. We should never use terms like that. That's difficult. When we hear stuff like that, it's our responsibility to say, that's not how we talk here, that's not how we behave. And these are the steps that we're taking to make sure that that happens. I would be honored to serve as your superintendent. I would be honored to fight for the city of Boston. The reason why I'm here is because the Boston Public Schools has done so much for me, not just as a student, but as an adult, as an educator, and it is where I learned how to be a great teacher, and it's where I want to finish my career. I'm not here looking at this as a stepping stone. I want to be here 5, 10 years from now, where we're saying, wow, look at that, 5 years from now, we're almost closing the achievement gap. And 10 years from now, I want to be sitting here saying, we did this for our city. We're a model of excellence. And I know that I will need parents and the rest of the community to help me do this. So thank you.
I have a very serious question for you.
Yeah.
From Fenway High School.
Okay.
Will you be able, if chosen as superintendent, will you be able to genuinely cheer for Fenway High School when we play against Cathedral?
That's a tough question. Over time, yes. Over time, yes. So here's the wonderful thing. I will win both ways because it's for kids in Boston. The answer is yes. And I want you to know this. I cheer for the kids all the time. I cheer for Boston kids all the time. I'm a Boston kid.
Thank you.
With that, I will close. Thank you, Dr. Santos. I know it's been a long day and a long process. Thank you for your patience and your diligence and your openness to answer our questions. I'd like to thank our panelists for the 3 nights of really hard work and long and thoughtful questioning. And with that, I bid everybody at home and on TV and live stream a good night.
Thank you.